to the Unseen Podcast, a podcast dedicated to missing people, unresolved cases, and UK true crime. Today we're going to explore an older case from 1906. Lillie Yolande Marie Rochaid was travelling back to England from her home country of France after the Christmas holidays. She was making the journey alone, however she was used to the trip and was a seasoned traveller on the trains. On this occasion, however, something went wrong along the way and Lillie sadly died on the journey. The question of what actually happened to her on that train is still speculated upon today. This episode contains descriptions that some listeners may find distressing, so listener discretion is advised. Lillie Yolande Marie Rochaid was born in 1888 into a wealthy and well-known family. She was the daughter of Count Rochaid, a member of a noble Lebanese family called the House of Al-Dada. Over hundreds of years, the family have made their mark in lots of different ways, becoming statesmen, priests and administrators in various governments around the world. They were an affluent family, and in 1879, before Lillie's birth, her father relocated to an area of France called Dinard. Dinard is located in northwestern France in the region of Brittany, and is known today as the Cannes of the North, due to expensive hotels, film festivals and famous visitors and residents. During the late 19th century, Dinard became a very fashionable place to live for wealthy English and American tourists, and the construction of new hotels in what used to be a small fishing village meant that celebrities also wanted to be seen there. Winston Churchill was a frequent visitor, along with artists like Picasso. Count Rochaid is often noted as being pivotal in the development of the resort, building it up to the place that it is today. So much so that a square in the town is named after him. This is where Lillie grew up in the late 19th century, and by all accounts she was afforded every luxury. This was not, however, where Lillie called home, as she spent the vast majority of her childhood and teenage years in England. She attended Princethorpe Priory on the site of St Mary's Chapel in Rugby in Warwickshire. The priory had been settled by Benedictine monks and was strictly a religious school. Lillie had spent most of her life at the priory and it was home to her. The chaplain would later describe Lillie as a good child who had never known anything else except convent life. Despite her family's wealth, Lillie was used to a more simple lifestyle at the priory, and she was also independent. She would often travel between Princethorpe and Dinard during holidays, and would often take the train to get there. This was not unusual for her, and so when it was time to return there after the Christmas holidays in 1906, Lillie did not think twice. It's reported that she had plans to leave France early on the 18th of January, and she was going to take a train from Euston to Rugby to take her back to the priory. It was known that on that day Lillie left St Malo, a port city close to Dinard, and travelled to London early that morning. It's reported in the Northampton Mercury that the train that Lillie had been on from St Malo did not leave Southampton until 9:40 that morning, and did not reach London's Waterloo until 12 noon. It's believed that she then took a taxi to Euston, and possibly missed her connecting train there to take her to Rugby. At around 12:20 p.m, Lillie sent a telegram to Father Hans, the chaplain at the priory, to explain that she would be arriving later on that night. Lillie then waited around, however it was known that she did not get on the 1:30 train or the 2 o'clock train. She opted to get on the 2:45 train instead. It's thought that Lillie may have decided to take this train as it would take her as far as Marton, which was close to Princethorpe, meaning that she did not have to wait at Rugby. Lillie boarded the train and the journey carried on as planned, with the train arriving into Rugby just after 5 p.m. Inspector Franklin was at the station at the time that the train pulled in, and he noticed that the door to the second-class carriage was open. This was unusual, as there was no real reason why the door would be open. Upon investigation of the carriage, it was clear that there had been someone in there, as there were belongings left on one of the seats. A box, a black bag and a copy of the Daily Mail newspaper were left in the carriage, however there was no one to be seen. This alarmed Inspector Franklin, who quickly alerted some workers at the station to the situation. David Reed, a foreman plate layer at the station, and a man named Perkins were asked to go back and retrace the route the train had just taken. Other previous stations were also contacted. The fear was that if the door to the carriage was open, then something could have happened to one of the passengers. The men travelled back along the route and did not find anything until they reached the Crick Tunnel, located around 8 miles from Rugby, where the train had stopped. Inside the tunnel, they discovered the body of a woman lying at the side of the tracks. She was wearing a muslin blouse, a black skirt and a jacket, and the body looked as though it had come from the train as it went through the tunnel. An alarm was immediately raised, and police arrived at the scene to examine the body. There were a number of items found: a gold watch and chain with a crucifix on, a bracelet and a ring. She also had a purse containing £1 10 shillings in gold coins, and 9 shillings and 10 pence in silver and copper coins. She also had a bunch of keys and 2 train tickets. It did not take long upon examination of the belongings found on the body and in the carriage for the police to identify the woman. It was Lillie Rochaid. But what exactly had happened to her? How had she ended up on the tracks? The tunnel was searched for any evidence at the same time as the body was analysed. The walls were looked at in particular, however no marks were discovered that appeared to correspond with the incident. The police were able to establish that it looked as though Lillie had exited the train at around 190 yards from the entrance of the tunnel, after the previous stop in Northampton, and that after leaving the train she had been dragged 30 yards backwards. This was discovered by examining the stones at the side of the tracks, the top layer of which were blackened by the trains passing by. The stones underneath remained white, however, and it was clear that they had been disturbed when Lillie had landed in the tunnel. News that a woman had been found on the tracks in Crick Tunnel reached the public, and there was a huge amount of speculation about what could have happened. Lillie was a wealthy young woman travelling alone on the train, and there were fears that something awful may have occurred during the journey. The circumstances that Lillie had been found in were certainly a concern, and there was an immediate investigation into the case. Inspector Franklin, who had been the first to notice the open door to the carriage, explained that he had found nothing unusual there aside from the belongings that had been left and the absence of any passengers. He said there seemed to be no indications that a struggle had taken place, and nothing had been displaced. He said he checked the lock on the carriage door and that it was in proper working order. He also noted that the window was closed. He checked the door from the outside and found that it did properly fasten but had not been locked. When asked, Inspector Franklin said he did not observe anyone get out of the carriage when it arrived at Rugby. Frederick Walter Euston, who also examined the train at Rugby, made similar observations, and when asked if he believed someone could have got out of the train at the station as it was pulling in, he replied it would be rather difficult and believed they may have met with an accident if they did, as the train pulled in at around 7 or 8 miles an hour. Many of the questions being asked by the witnesses at Rugby revolved around the fact that someone may have been with Lillie in the carriage as it travelled through Crick Tunnel, and they may have been responsible for her death. The observations that the doors, locks and carriage appeared to be in good order did not suggest that something untoward had happened in there beforehand. This, however, was up for interpretation, and it was something that Lillie's family did not agree with. They pressed for further inquiries to be made by the North Western Railway Company into the incident. Just over a week after Lillie's body was discovered, an inquest was held at the Railway Hotel in Kilsby, a village 5 miles from Rugby. It was held by Divisional Coroner Mr. C. H. Davis and sought to come to some sort of conclusion about her death. The events of the 18th of January were laid out for the jury, and the inquest was attended by a number of people, including a representative for the railway company, Mr. G. L. Smythe, Superintendent Walker from Euston Police, Police Superintendent Braun, and Father Walter Hans, chaplain of St. Mary's Priory at Princethorpe. Inspector Franklin and Frederick Elson describe what they observed as the train pulled into Rugby. Members of staff from Northampton, the previous stop before Rugby, were also brought forward as witnesses. It's reported in the Northampton Mercury that Mr. Widowson, station master at Northampton, explained that when the train left Northampton at 4:28 p.m, he made sure that all the doors were fastened. When asked if he noticed any young ladies sitting in any of the compartments, he said that he didn't, and that all of the passengers appeared to be behaving as normal. He also confirmed that when he made inquiries with his staff, they had also not noticed anything out of the ordinary. Father Hans questioned Mr. Widowson at this point and asked if that suggested that there may not have been any young girls travelling alone, as they may have stood out. This question suggested that perhaps the reason that Lillie had not stood out to anyone was because she was not travelling alone in the carriage at all. Mr. Widowson, however, stated that this may not be the sole reason why no one noticed her that day. He also confirmed that he was used to seeing young women travelling alone, and therefore Lillie would not have stood out to him or any of his staff. Henry Smith was the guard on the train as it travelled to Rugby. He testified that when they arrived at Northampton, he also checked that all the doors were fastened properly. As he did this, he said he didn't notice a young woman travelling in a carriage by herself. He also told the coroner that he frequently looked out of the windows on the opposite side of the train where the door had been found open, but did not notice anything odd. In fact, all of the signals were fine as the train approached Rugby, and therefore they came into the station at a good pace and did not need to slow down very much. Father Hans also had a question for Smith, asking if anyone could have got out of the train without him noticing, to which he replied no, they could not. Smith told the coroner that if a door had opened unexpectedly and a woman had tried to lean out and pull it shut again, they would have had great difficulty doing that, and may have been pulled out of the train. A doctor named Dr. A.G. Smith also testified about what was found at Lillie's post-mortem. He explained that her injuries were consistent with the fall onto the tracks and in the tunnel, and showed no other signs of a struggle. As reported in the Northampton Mercury, Dr. Smith said, "She had not been molested or touched in any way so far as he could judge." During the inquest, Father Hans expressed his opinion that it seemed like belongings were missing from Lillie's body, including a gold and pearl chain and an outer fur jacket. As no one could be absolutely sure that Lillie had been wearing these things during her journey, he dismissed this, saying they could not be accepted as evidence. The coroner addressed the jury, stating that it seemed as though suicide was not likely in Lillie's case, and that the doctor had ruled out foul play as being involved in her death. He explained that the jury had to rule either an accidental death or an open verdict. After the jury consulted for some time, the foreman stated that they had unanimously come to a decision that this young lady was on Thursday found dead on the railway. This verdict meant that the jury had decided on an open verdict. There was not enough evidence to suggest any official cause of death. Despite the fact that the inquest had taken place, there was still confusion about what had really happened to Lillie. Newspapers began to publish stories about how perhaps claustrophobia had been one of the reasons that she had decided to open the door herself and then fallen out. It was also suggested that she may have been overcome by a bout of hysteria and decided to try and leave the train for some reason. These theories were very much denied by Lillie's family and those that knew her at Princethorpe Priory. 2 letters were written about these theories, one by the prioress and another by Miss J.M. Paulet, a secular mistress. Miss Paulet stated in her letter reported by the Birmingham Daily Gazette, "I have read the absurd theory which has been put forward to explain the mystery of Mademoiselle Rochaid's death in the Crick Tunnel. I have known and taught Mademoiselle Lillie Rochaid for about 2 years, and have travelled with her on railway journeys and in closed carriages repeatedly. In fact, I accompanied her the last time she left Princethorpe for her home on Sunday afternoon, December the 17th, 1905, travelling with her in a closed carriage the 8 miles between Princethorpe to Rugby, and from there by the same railway line to Euston." I never saw any sign of the nervous symptoms suggested, nor did she ever lead anyone to suspect that she was subject to anything of the kind under any circumstances whatsoever. She could not be described as nervous, even in the ordinary sense of the word. All those who knew Mademoiselle Lillie Rochaid as we do here will agree in thinking the explanation quite preposterous. The prioress also echoed this statement, explaining, "The statements published by certain newspapers about hysteria and claustrophobia are quite false." The girls here have travelled with her quite frequently, and when asked if she was ever given to this nervous excitement in the train, they unanimously said no. We have known her for 2 years, and she has never shown the slightest sign of hysteria. Many of the people who knew Lillie stated that she did not seem like she had claustrophobia, and this did not contribute to her death. Father Hans was another person to cast doubt on what happened to Lillie that day. In an article in the Northampton Mercury, he stated, "My conviction is that Mademoiselle Rochaid received a fright, flew instinctively towards the door and fell out on the line. The affair in the tunnel was, I firmly believe, neither accident or suicide. She was not a stupid girl. She would not do anything in the tunnel which will lead to an accident. You must remember that she was perfectly accustomed to the line. As to suicide, those that knew her, like the sisters here and myself, know quite well the thing would be impossible to her. Something frightened her in that carriage. She was an extremely sensitive girl. An approach from a man might have caused her to cast herself to eternity." The circumstances surrounding Lillie's death certainly caused those that knew her some concern, as they did not believe that it had simply been the result of an accident. This to them did not seem possible. The police investigating her death also faced some setbacks. The problem was that the carriage that Lillie was in was a closed carriage, meaning that unless someone had entered the same carriage at a stop along the way, passengers could not freely walk from one carriage to another. The corridor system, which was introduced around this time on trains, where passengers could travel from one carriage to another, was not in operation on that particular train that Lillie had got on that day. This meant that unless the police found further witnesses, then finding out exactly what had happened to her was going to be difficult. They had been able to track down one witness who testified at the inquest about what he had observed. The witness was a ticket inspector who confirmed that he checked Lillie's ticket when she had boarded the Rugby-bound train at 2:45 from platform 13 at Euston station. He told the Northampton Mercury, "I remember the young lady very well because she was unusually agitated and kept on asking me questions about the time that she would arrive at Marton. She was the only second-class passenger travelling to Marton, and she travelled alone. She was so agitated that I took particular notice of her and was standing opposite the carriage when the train left. She was standing at the door and kept looking up and down the platform." This information was interesting as it appeared to suggest that something could have been wrong before Lillie boarded the train. What could this have been? The fact that no one noticed Lillie in the carriage at any of the further stops, however, was a problem, as it meant that they did not have much to go on in terms of explaining exactly what happened during the journey. More witnesses were tracked down who saw Lillie at Euston station at around midday. A witness, a station interpreter, explained that he had seen Lillie at around 12:30, and she asked him when the next train to Marton would depart, as she had missed the 12:15 one. She told him that she wanted to leave her luggage in the hall, but he told her it was best to leave it in the cloakroom. This witness confirmed that Lillie was alone. Another witness, a post office official at the station, came forward to say that they believed they saw her at around 2:40 p.m. She appeared to be with another lady, and the woman fitting Lillie's description asked about the 2:45 train. He gave them the information and they headed straight back out of the door towards the train and the ticket inspectors. The woman with Lillie was described as fair, with something hung over her arm like a cloak or a rug. This seemed to be at odds with the description of events given by the ticket inspector, however, who said that Lillie was alone and agitated when she came to him. There was also the fact that there were 2 hours of Lillie's afternoon unaccounted for, from when she arrived at Euston to boarding the train. What did she do for those 2 hours? Could something have happened during this time? This gave rise to speculation that someone could have seen Lillie and perhaps followed her to the train. Count Joseph Rochaid, Lillie's uncle, certainly believed that this could be a possibility, telling the London Daily News, "Something makes me think that she may have been followed. I cannot tell you what I think exactly, it's something that I feel. I cannot rest until I have satisfied myself upon this point. I shall remain in London and carry on the investigation until I have found, if I can, how my niece spent those momentous 2 hours before proceeding on what was her last journey." The presence of a third party was also suggested by her family and friends, as they believed and had stated that items were missing from her body, including a medal that she often wore and a fur coat. The coroner, however, stated that he had no evidence that she had indeed been wearing these things at the time of her journey on the train. Lillie's family continued to mourn for what happened to her and tried to come to terms with the circumstances surrounding her death. The incident had, however, caught the public's attention, and the newspapers began to run stories about the possibility of a tunnel ripper. The mystery of the situation gave rise to speculation that someone must have attacked Lillie in the carriage. The reason for this was the fact that there was no evidence to support the theories of suicide or accidental death. The People newspaper in February 1906 reported that the cabman who drove Lillie to Euston from Waterloo had not yet been tracked down, or a woman who was reportedly seen having a long conversation with Lillie at Euston station. Nobody had been seen in the carriage with Lillie, and while this could support the theory that something must have happened to her while she was alone, some believe that this meant it was possible that someone had in fact been in the carriage with her and wanted to do her some harm. In the same article, it is actually reported that the police gave a statement to the press and confirmed that they believed that Lillie had indeed been murdered, saying, "There is only one feasible theory in this case, and that is that the girl was murdered. We have only just been informed that her hat was not found 200 yards up the tunnel, but 30 yards from the entrance. This is a very significant and startling fact." This discovery implied that whatever had happened to Lillie had begun at the entrance to the tunnel and ended with her being thrown out of the carriage in some way. It was not necessarily an instantaneous event such as may have happened in an accident. The police also confirmed that they tracked down a witness on the train who heard a scream as the train entered the tunnel, which could have implied that someone was waiting for it to go into the tunnel in the hope that it would muffle any screams. The police spokesman also brought up a link to another tunnel mystery that I have talked about before on the podcast and covered in a Patreon bonus episode, the case of Mary Money. She was found in the Mercham Tunnel in 1905 after appearing to fall out of the carriage. Mary was also travelling alone. The police spokesman said, "It's extraordinary that all of these alleged accidents take place in tunnels. If they were caused by insecurely closed doors, they would be quite as likely to take place in the daylight." These statements caused some to worry that there was someone out there targeting women travelling alone and was gaining access to their carriages before deciding to strike when they entered tunnels. This was a terrifying thought for women travelling by train. Another problem was also brought up in the wake of Lillie's death: the danger of having a closed carriage and not being able to get up and move around the train. Lillie's family and friends explained that they believed a corridor system was much safer and needed to be employed on all trains. This was a change that did happen not long after Lillie's death. It was also suggested that the way that the doors on trains locked and opened was unsafe, with one woman writing into the newspapers detailing her own experience of nearly falling out of one while travelling. Speculation was certainly rife, however this did not get the police or the family any closer to figuring out what happened to Lillie. There were a large number of possibilities for what happened, and without evidence there were no real conclusions. One thing was certain, however: Lillie's family and acquaintances believed that she had not received justice and that her death could have been handled a lot better. They believed that the inquest was not handled professionally, with Lillie's uncle saying that he rushed to try and make it and that the inquest should have been delayed to allow him time to get there. Father Hans also found it strange that no one that actually knew Lillie from Princethorpe Priory was invited to the inquest, saying that he was only there as he went voluntarily. Lillie's uncle also did not think that the railway inspectors should have allowed the train to carry on running after such a short examination of the carriage. He explained there was not enough done in that moment to establish without doubt what had happened to her. In a similar way, Father Hans criticised the investigation, saying that there should have been a second doctor allowed to examine Lillie's body and cast doubt on whether or not all of the stations along the route had been checked, to see if anybody could have got into the carriage with her. They were unhappy with the way that the whole investigation had been carried out, and did not believe either of the theories of suicide or accident that had been suggested at the inquest. So what do we really know about what happened to Lillie that day? We know she arrived into England and caught a cab from Waterloo to Euston. It's clear that she missed her train and had decided to get on a later one. There are no witnesses to confirm where she was in the next 2 hours, however she did board the train at 2:45 p.m. A ticket inspector confirmed this but said she was agitated and looking down the platform. Most witnesses confirmed that she was alone in the carriage, however the post office official at Euston possibly saw her with another woman before boarding the train. Nobody saw anything suspicious en route, or at the stops that had been checked, and Lillie did not catch anyone's attention. At Crick Tunnel, something occurred which meant Lillie ended up being thrown from the train with her hat landing nearly 200 yards away from her body. Her belongings were found in the carriage, however some items may indeed have been missing. A scream was also heard by a witness as the train entered the tunnel. The question is, did Lillie have a problem with the door and tragically fall out of the train? Did she decide to commit suicide, or did someone follow her into the carriage and push her out? I will leave you to come to your own conclusions, however there is a distinct lack of evidence for many of the options. It is definitely a mystery, however not a unique one, as this same fate befell a number of people travelling on trains at the time. It's evident that Lillie's death had a huge impact on her family and those that knew her, and it's sad that her death is still listed as inconclusive to the present day. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I would love to hear your thoughts on this case, so let me know on social media. Thank you as always to our Patreon supporters. I appreciate all the support you give the podcast. I also want to thank our newest patron, Minna from True Crime Finland. If you get a chance, go over and listen to her podcast. It's really, really good. If you would like to support us over there to get stickers, shoutouts, bonus episodes, and ad-free early access, the link is in the show notes. You can also help by reviewing the podcast wherever you listen or by subscribing to our YouTube channel, where I upload the audio from the episodes. Thank you to Nellie Noodle for your 5-star review this week. If you want to contact me, you can by following the podcast on social media on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, or if you have any suggestions for future episodes or any other inquiries, please email me at theunseenpod@gmail.com. I just want to apologise if you've been experiencing any random adverts in the middle of sentences recently. That obviously should not have been happening, and I have figured out what's going on and I'm working to fix it. Thanks to everyone who let me know that it was happening. Stay tuned for a promo from Christine at the True Crime Files podcast this week. I'm sure you'll really enjoy it, so give it a go. Thanks for listening. As always, I'm Caprice, and this has been Unseen.
Hi, I'm Christine, and I'd like to introduce you to the True Crime Files podcast, a bi-weekly podcast that focuses on mysterious disappearances and unsolved murders. Every 2 weeks, we'll be releasing an episode that'll help you get to know a case really well without having to invest a lot of your time. Derived from the articles up on the True Crime Files website, you'll find that our show covers a diversity of victims and perspectives. You'll probably also notice that our episodes are narrated by Scott Fuller from the Frozen Truth and Status Pending podcasts. Be sure to subscribe to the True Crime Files today so that you never miss an episode. Thanks so much for listening, being a part of our true crime community, and helping to shine a light on cases that might otherwise be overlooked or underreported.